All right, good afternoon. So it doesn't look like we have a ton of participants here today, but we'll go ahead nonetheless. So I suspect that's what's happening is since I'm making the video available, that people are just opting to look at the video later on. And I hate that that's the case, but I also don't want to not provide the video in case there's some significant reason that that you need to be able to view it later on. So hopefully, if somebody could give me a chat real quick and let me know that that they are in fact seeing the slides right now. Okay. All right. Thank you all. All right. So today's topic, we're going to talk about conflict and negotiation. And we're going to talk about it in terms of the business environment, the work environment, and how we see that playing out. So when we think about conflict, we can ask the question, what is conflict? What do we mean by conflict? And we can come up with a number of different definitions, but we'll just go with this one that the book gives you. Conflict, a process that begins when one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something the first party cares about. Now, remember, there's this term perceived or perception now, and we've said this a couple of times throughout the class that one person's perception is their reality. And we as leaders and managers have to learn how to deal with it. So if we use this definition and now we start to think about that there has to be this this belief that there's this disassociated issue or there's a conflict that exists between two people. If one of the people doesn't know that there's a conflict or that there's an issue, then there's really no conflict. You may have an issue with me, but if I'm not aware of it, then there's no conflict between us two because it takes both of us to establish that conflict relationship. And then when we look at this, we have to look at the absence of it. If nobody believes there's a conflict or nobody's aware of it, then it doesn't really exist. So I asked the question in my intro discussion this week, is conflict good or bad? And, as you can well imagine, with a lot of the topics we've talked about in this class, when we think about it, we're looking at this or that, one position or another. And the answer is often, it really depends. It really depends on the scenario and how it's used. So we could talk about this and we'll look at a couple of things that relate to conflict. And then later on, we're going to talk about how we resolve it or how we deal with it in the workplace. So now, what's the source of conflict? And in academic terms, we use the term loci. What the three loci of conflict? What's the originating point? Where do they reside? So we can think about functional conflict, the way things are performing or going. We can think about dysfunctional types of conflict, and we'll look at the source. So when we think about, excuse me, I've got pollen in the air. I have my windows open. So when we think about this continuum of conflict and whether it's good or bad, we can actually plot this out and look at the level of conflict. If we go on the lower end with no conflict, and we go on the high end with extreme conflict, you could see how things affect the workplace differently. How we would start to look at whether or not conflict is driving performance or conflict is enabling poor performance. If we have no conflict at all, we're down here, then it's kind of dysfunctional. We start to look at, this apathetic or lethargic type of an atmosphere. If we go to the high end, then it's also dysfunctional. We're looking at disruption and chaos in the workplace. What we essentially want to do is try to hit that happy medium. We want to look at right in the middle. We want to get to where conflict is driving the workforce and driving performance, and it forces people to look at themselves critically and whether or not they are actually performing well enough or in a satisfactory fashion for the workplace. So if we look at these three types, we're talking about task conflict, the actual work that needs to be done, the relationship conflict between the people, the interpersonal relationships, and then the process conflict, the how the work is being done. So if we think about it in just simple terms, we can look at the what, with whom, and how. All right. So if we think about dyadic, we're talking about between two people. We're looking at intragroup and intergroup, the difference between conflict within the group, within members of the group, or conflict external to the group with other groups or other individuals. So we go back to thinking about the what, with whom, and how, and then we're going to lay on top of that between whom. So we're establishing this conflict relationship. Now, the book lays out different stages here when we talk about the potential all the way to outcomes, and we see how these interactions occur and how they impact overall performance. Now, if we're looking at the intent of conflict, people will look at it from different perspectives. We're going to look at competing, collaborating. We're going to look at accommodating, compromising, and those types of things. So when we look at this relationship between people, we also have to try to think about is what is their intent? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to impact? What are they trying to force? And then how strong is that conflict? We've looked in the past talked about your strength of your emotions and your intent and your motivation. Well, conflict also has a strength attribute. And we can look at all the way from not having any conflict at all the way to it's just total annihilation. We're looking to absolutely destroy the other party, and any number of pieces along that continuum there. All right, so if we start to think about conflict management techniques, we're going to look at how we would problem solve, how we would discuss with other people, how we would align goals and objectives and think about the common good and how we're moving forward, and how we can give up something for a certain aspect or a certain action in return. So that's all part of our human behavior, our negotiation, our adjustment in this relationship as we go through. And there's a number of different methods that we'll talk about. Now, if we start to look at how we would address conflict management or this process, we would start to look at the outcome. What we're looking for is, in the end, here's what we want to achieve. Anytime you have a conflict resolution session, you should always be looking for what is the acceptable outcome? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to get out of the conflict? And we would look at things like when we're using positive conflict in the workplace, is it constructive? Does it progress the goals and objectives? Does it improve quality? Does it force people to do those things that they're challenged to do, or they're tasked to do, or they're paid to do in the workplace? And then obviously, conversely, we're talking about destructive conflict when it's disruptive, when it breeds discontent, when the group becomes less effective, the performance deteriorates or goes down over time. So when we look at an individual, how do you approach it? How do you, as the leader and the manager, look at what we would do in conflict resolution? So we want to think about this in terms of the different types of conflict we've already mentioned. So from a functional perspective, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about where is there disagreement? How do we identify that? How do we bring people together and identify those common goals? How do we overcome personality disagreements, cultural disagreements, those types of things, and unify those people toward a common goal and in the common direction? And then when we look at the different approaches, we can obviously focus our efforts not just on the individual, but on the good of the organization, on how we can resolve this conflict as we move forward. Now, when we start thinking about groups and intra-group and intergroup, that's a little more complicated. We start talking about just not taking the individual, but now what is the collective opinion of the group? What is the thought process? What's the emotional aspect of that group? And how do we manage it? How do we manage it internally? And how do we manage it externally? So when we think about looking at group conflict, we have to get to what are the underlying reasons? What's the source of the conflict? And then again, it goes back to always looking at what's the goal and objective of the organization, of the group, and of the individual, and making sure that we're keeping people focused on that. And I often use the phrase is every time we do something, how is that taking us one step closer to accomplishing our goals? So if we focus the group and the individual on achievement of those goals, then we minimize those external factors that become conflict issues, and we start to push them aside and get people refocused on what we're trying to accomplish. Now, we've talked about the differences in culture and countries and things like that, and how those people respond to conflict, how those people respond from different cultures, different countries, different backgrounds. How do they respond to either somebody up in their face and trying to push them to do something, or laying back and allowing them to develop the way forward? So it's important for us to think about all of the different cultural aspects and how we start to see people, how they identify themselves in the workplace, how they think about those things, and how they react to those types of things. So now the workplace is very complicated. We have everything from the different cultures, the races, the sexes, age groups, those types of things, all that diversity that lends itself to getting to different ideas, different thought processes also brings about a lot of conflict, because it's embedded in misunderstanding, misinterpretation, those types of things. And the way people talk to each other, the way they handle issues are ripe for development of conflict scenarios. And we just have to learn how to operate within that. And as we develop in leaders and managers, how to identify the right courses of action in the right scenarios. Now, let's look at an example here. And if somebody would send me a chat and make sure when this starts that they can actually hear the audio when it's playing. I just want to make sure. All right, it doesn't look like. Hold on one second.
Has anybody seen Kelly?
I've seen Kelly. Yeah, pretty much all over. Have you seen the shirt she's wearing today?
Yeah, and that's actually the problem. Yeah. Some people are saying that she's being offensive or something. And I'm the one that's got to say something to her about it.
Who are these people? What's their problem? Man, Kelly's the only thing that keeps me coming to work every day.
Tell me about it. But you know women. Women are sensitive. Especially Beth.
Oh.
Yeah, this is the 4th time she's complained about Kelly's clothes.
Yeah.
Just gonna leave her this note.
So we finally made it back after that delayed flight. It was awful. Hey, Cal. John left you a note.
Oh.
Dear Kelly, as much as I love your shirt, this isn't that kind of business. Ha ha.
Please wear a sweater over it in the future if you are going to continue wearing revealing clothing. You're making Beth uncomfortable. John. What? What's wrong with this shirt? Do you think it's too revealing?
I think it's cute.
Just because I don't dress like a librarian and talk about professional. A Post-it note on my computer where anybody could see? Good job there, John.
Whatever. You should just ignore it.
Oh, I am. Right after I send an email to Beth.
And copy John.
Definitely. And maybe even a few other people.
John, our manager John. Really? I mean, riddled with serious issues. Okay, let's talk about what the initial conflict is. The initial conflict is that Beth, the coworker, has complained about Kelly's attire, saying it's inappropriate. Now, let's talk about the legal ramifications of this complaint. Before we get into, I mean, let's talk about his initial conflict. He's bought himself another conflict, is what I think has happened. By mismanaging it, he now has another conflict. The original conflict is Beth, the coworker, comes to John, the boss, about Kelly's attire.
Right.
Okay, there are legal implications of that if she is uncomfortable, if she says they're sexually revealing. He's got a mandatory reporting obligation. He's got to do something about it, assuming that it fits in with the reasonable person standard. The outfit, I thought, was borderline. I didn't think it was grossly distasteful, but I think a reasonable person probably may have found it somewhat offensive. Okay, so we've got an issue that we have to do something about, right?
Yes.
Now let's talk about what John chose to do.
Has anybody seen Kelly?
I've seen Kelly.
Is that Beth, the coworker, has complained about Kelly's attire, saying it's inappropriate. Now let's talk about the legal ramifications of this complaint. Before we get into, I mean, let's talk about his initial conflict. He's bought himself another conflict, is what I think has happened. By mismanaging it, he now has another conflict. The original conflict is Beth, the coworker, comes to John, the boss, about Kelly's attire.
Right.
Okay, there are legal implications of that if she is uncomfortable, if she says they're sexually revealing. He's got a mandatory reporting obligation. He's got to do something about it, assuming that it fits in with the reasonable person standard. The outfit, I thought, was borderline. I didn't think it was grossly distasteful, but I think a reasonable person probably may have found it somewhat offensive. Okay, so we've got an issue that we have to do something about, right?
Yes.
Now let's talk about what John chose to do.
All right, so let's talk about this for a second. Where have you seen this occur in the workplace? Have you seen issues with dress code or something like that, or the way people come into work, and how have managers and leaders in your organizations dealt with that in the past? So somebody chime in. All right, anybody? Can everybody still hear me?
I don't know if it's just me, but I've never had that issue at work.
Okay. All right. So if we start thinking about this scenario and what has occurred, what should, or let's look at it first from the perspective of what did the supervisor do wrong?
I think first and foremost, leaving the sticky note was very unprofessional. And then the fact that he called out Beth on the sticky note instead of keeping it anonymous just creates more conflict. And that he was talking to a fellow coworker about it before leaving the note. That was unprofessional.
Exactly. You're exactly right. So one of the things that we deal with is, especially in smaller organizations, as people move up the ranks in the workplace, we have supervisors and leaders and managers who may have been your coworker standing right next to you the day before. So there's oftentimes this difficulty in separating themselves from the buddy, that they were just yesterday or the week before, and how they talk to people and with people, and what their requirements are and what they should be doing as they move up and take on more leadership roles. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to manage those types of situations. Now, when we think about all these questions, we can look at what did the supervisor do wrong? What about the male coworker? When the boss came to him, what would you do with his response and the way he responded to just a question about, has anybody seen Kelly? Obviously, that sets a tone. Him not managing that sets a tone that type of attitude and action is okay in the workplace. So the supervisor now has another responsibility that he has to correct this guy and make sure that he's abiding by the rules and regulations of the workplace. Obviously Kelly should not have gone, and blasted that email. If she had a problem with the supervisor, she should have just gone in and talked to them directly about it. Now, the first thing, if I'm talking about how we would look at handling that type of situation, the first thing I would have done is just call the original reporter in and ask what the issue was and see if it really was an issue or if it was just something that was a perception issue with that particular reporter. Again, remembering their perception is their reality. So we have to honor that and understand that it's real to them. But if it doesn't rise to the occasion of something that a general person, a reasonable person would understand that there's an issue there, then we may just have to go back to them and say, look, there's nothing wrong with her dress, with the way Kelly dresses. It may be offensive to you. It may be something that you wouldn't do, but it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of an issue in the workplace. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We would have to look at what a reasonable person would say in that case. So when we start thinking about managing conflict, obviously we can get into negotiation. And negotiation, really, we're going to talk about how the parties involved may exchange things that are of value, goods or services, to agree on a final outcome. So we can use terms, we can use bargaining and negotiation as an internal or a interchangeable list of terms. And really, we're talking about trying to satisfy most people in the conflict or in the issue. Now, when we look at this and we think about two different types, I typically, when I'm doing this in the class, I will draw a pie, a circle with slices of pie, and you all know that if you have a 9-inch pie and you divide it And if somebody wants more pie, then it has to come out of somebody's piece of the pie. So that would be distributive bargaining. That is, there's a set amount and we distribute it, and one person's going to get more, one person's going to get less. So there's this win-lose scenario that we have to deal with. But we can look at integrative bargaining, where we're going to start to think about, well, why not increase the pie? Now, put that in business terms. If we have a set budget for the year, and let's say the organization has $100,000 to use among all the departments, then we would look at dividing that up and making sure we try to satisfy the high priority requirements for each department. If somebody needs more in a distributed bargaining environment, it has to come out of somebody else's budget. In an integrative bargaining scenario, we would look at increasing the budget above $100,000 to be able to account for that increased need in other areas. Now, when we think about bargaining and negotiating, we have to think about the notion of what somebody wants on one hand, what the other person wants, and where is there this overlap. And so if we visually look at that, we start to think about this settlement range right in the middle. If I'm selling a car to you and I want $10,000 for it, but I'm willing to accept $8,000, you want to buy a car as cheaply as you can. You want to pay $7,000 for it, ideally, but you're willing to go up to $9,000, then our settlement range is somewhere in that $8,000 to $9,000 area. As soon as we get in that range, we can strike a deal. But if I'm willing to sell the car and I want 10, I'm willing to accept 8, you want to start out in your ideal scenarios, you want to pay 5, but you'll pay no more than 7. You'll notice we have no settlement range. We can't come to an agreement. There's no number that both of us can walk away from the table feeling satisfied that we got something out of the deal. So that settlement range and understanding that negotiation is critical to the process. All right. So when we're thinking about distributive bargaining and we're looking at this negotiation, one of the things that history and studies have shown is that make the first offer. Go in the power position. And we establish what's called anchoring bias. If you've ever watched the show Pawn Stars in Vegas, and somebody comes in and they have an artifact that they want $50,000 for it, the first thing that the owner of the pawn shop will do is say, I can't see giving you anything more than $10,000. Well, that's a huge disconnect. And then oftentimes what happens is that $10,000 as the first offer becomes the anchoring point. And so if you get them a little bit above that 10,000, then you feel like you've achieved something, but it's nowhere near the original $50,000 that they were looking for. And then one of the other things we'll see is create this sense of urgency. Give a timeline. My offer is good until X time or X day for so many days. So there has to be this urgency that we've created, and we're looking to establish that power position as we move through the negotiating timeline. So we can think of all kinds of examples. You hear those on TV. You think of examples in your own life or in negotiation. Think about political examples when the U.S. is dealing with China or North Korea or something like that. We'll often drive a scenario with a deal that has a timeline or an established anchor, trying to establish that power position. All right. So when we get into negotiation, one of the things that we have to understand is compromise oftentimes leads to or goes against a win-win situation. If you establish a position now where you're willing to just give up and give in, then there's no win-win possibility. We're not establishing a position where both people are trying to win something. All right. I'm going to go past this. Now, if we go back into earlier lessons and we start thinking about this, what are the negotiating tactics of different people? How about their personality traits? How about the difference between men and women and how they operate? How forceful are they? How outgoing are they? How about moods and emotions in your negotiation? Where does that lead you in terms of identifying the starting position and being able to effectively manage how you're going to negotiate through this conflict or resolve this issue that's put before you? How about culture? Do different people from different cultures negotiate differently? Absolutely. I can tell you, having lived in all kinds of places around the globe, different nationalities and different cultures just operate differently. Some are more forceful, some are more laid back, more willing to negotiate, more willing to give in, and that impacts their ability to negotiate and effectively resolve conflict or differences in opinion. All right, so you can imagine that people generally negotiate more effectively within their own culture than between cultures, because they know what to expect. They understand how people are going to operate. And then when we think about cross-cultural connections or negotiation, you have to have this openness and be willing to understand the other person's position and how they operate. And then when you think about the different cultures, they're going to have their go-to style, their method of negotiating, how they're going to enter into the negotiation, and how they're going to operate throughout. All right. We've talked about gender. We know that men and women are different. We also know that men and women negotiate differently, and that oftentimes leads to different outcomes. So when we think about women in particular, women are particularly more cooperative, pleasant, relationship oriented. So oftentimes that leads to a positive relationship when it comes to negotiating. Men are typically more forceful. So men rely on establishing that anchor bias or that power position. So the differences generally between the two sexes vary widely when it comes to negotiating style and the types of methodologies that they would use. So here's one example. There was a poll that asked a question about salary in job offerings. And the question was, do men or women, they asked men and they asked women, do you always negotiate for salary when starting a new position? And look at these results. So women by far said no, whereas men almost 50-50 said yes. And that comes from a position of, I'm just going to try to take a power position and try to get as much as I can on the male side, or I'm going to be satisfied with what I'm being offered and kind of let it be a win-win scenario for the women. So that just shows you the difference in the sexes and how they enter into negotiating in business deals and employment and those types of things. So when we think about this, we also can overlay what's the social context. What's our reputation? How do others view us? Are we viewed as the shady car salesman that can't be trusted? How does that impact your negotiating? If you're looked at somebody who's very trustworthy, obviously people are going to be more open and susceptible to a deal or even to a deal that is more advantageous to you than it is to them because of that relationship. And we think about those relationships. If we have somebody that we've worked with over and over and over again, our negotiation starts to get honed and sometimes becomes automatic because we know how people are going to perceive and how they're going to operate. Now, if we think about this in negotiation, we can look at third-party negotiating methods. We've heard these terms. We can look at a mediator, an arbitrator, or a conciliator. So we're talking about a mediator is somebody that just think about going to a marriage counselor or some type of counselor, and they bring two parties together and allow them to discuss and come to a solution themselves. Now, an arbitrator is a third-party person that would actually make the decision in the end. They would listen to both sides. And we hear in the business world about arbitration, and we also hear this term binding arbitration often when it comes to union discussions and negotiations. So if we think about just arbitration, we could allow someone to listen to the facts, listen to each side, and then make their decision. But then either or both parties could say, we still disagree with that decision, and they walk away from the table. Now, when it comes to binding arbitration, it's just what it says. Both parties agree up front in writing and sign that they will accept the outcome of the arbitration. That occurs both in union negotiations, in sports contract negotiations, those types of things, where somebody would be the third party decider and what they decide goes. And then a conciliator is, you may have heard this term by watching old mob movies or mafia movies. It's just somebody that goes and represents somebody and tries to cover their interest. So let's look at another example. And this one goes to negotiation.
You should just talk to him about it.
Okay, thanks. I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to need some support from Nathan on tackling those help desk callbacks.
Sounds reasonable. Nathan, you're the help desk expert. Any reason why you can't work with Bridget on this?
To tell the truth, I'd rather not step in after the customer's call has already been mishandled a few times.
Thanks for your support, Nathan.
Look, the way things used to go around here where conflict is concerned is that we used to just ignore it or to hide it, and then nothing ever got resolved. And as a result, a problem like this could stay around forever. Now look, it's no secret that this has been an issue between you two for quite some time now. And frankly, it's starting to affect the team's performance. Am I wrong? Okay, so why don't we try something different?
Like what?
Well, like trying to figure out what the real issue is between you two. Then, just maybe, we can finally put it to rest once and for all. And if not, well, it's only my third week as supervisor.
I'm game.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Bridget, it sounds to me as though you're asking for some guidance on how to deal with customer problems in one contact.
Yeah, the calls I'm getting are all hardware conflicts and interrupt levels, things I'm not up on yet.
And Nathan, it seems that when Bridget comes to you for guidance or support, you sometimes feel put on the spot?
Always. And always at the last minute. I mean, I'm not opposed to giving Bridget some coaching, but if you could just come to me and schedule it ahead of time?
Fair enough. How about tomorrow around 2?
All right, so what type of role is that manager playing? Are they a mediator or an arbitrator? Now, obviously, in this case, they're a mediator. They're working to resolve the conflict between the individuals and try to get to some common solution. So for us as leaders and managers, one of the things that we have to have is situational awareness. What's going on? How urgent is the crisis that we need to resolve? So sometimes you may need to revert to some authoritarian leadership style and just mandate what the outcome is going to be. Other times you may want to let things play out and let people come to the solution themselves. And in essence, when we do this over the course of time, we're going to come up with some building of trust between the organization and its entities and the leadership and management role, as we demonstrate how we can be reasonable, how we can be understanding, how we can identify and keep to the forefront the needs of the organization as well as the needs of the individual within the organization. So very short lesson this week when we're talking about this conflict resolution, identification of conflict, and how we would negotiate that and how we would operate in that environment. You have a couple of assignments that are due this week. Make sure that you do those early. Make sure that you, I think both of your assignments are in My Lab Management this week. And I don't believe you have anything due in My Learning. So make sure you take the time to go back and read the chapter, understand that, and figure out how you would apply these techniques in your own life, in your own workplace, maybe even in your own personal life. I appreciate the few of you that showed up. I appreciate you participating and being here. And I know this is difficult to operate in this environment. And just trust me, we're trying to get through the semester, and we'll do the best that we can. Are there any questions on this before we finish up? You guys talk less here than you do in class. All right, if there's no questions, so yes, one quick, we're looking at April 30th being the go back date, but that's all subject to change. And if you ask my personal opinion, I think we're probably going to operate all the way through the end of this semester in this fashion. Anything else? All right. Thank you all.